Welcome, everyone. My name is Monique Gignac. I'm a scientific director and senior scientist at the Institute. Welcome to our 2026 session of speaker series at the Institute. Before I introduce our speaker today, I want to just run through a little bit of housekeeping with you. If you would like to use the closed captioning, you will find it at the bottom of your screen. It may be a button for you to click on, or it may be under the More icon. And so you can activate that if you would like. We will have the recording and all the slides be made available to everyone. It takes a few days, but by next week, we will likely have that up and ready. If you have a question or a comment, and we hope that you will engage with the speaker at the end of the presentation, we are asking that you put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So you can type it there, and I will try to get to people's comments. We often get a large number of questions, but we really welcome the comments and the questions that you have for our speakers. If I'm not able to ask the question to Dr. Van Eerd, please feel free to reach out to him, and you can ask him your question directly. We will sometimes group questions. So if you have a similar question, I may not read out exactly what's been asked, but if I'm seeing other people asking something similar. But again, we really do encourage you to ask questions and leave us your comments. So let's turn to our speaker today. I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Dwayne Van Eerd. He is a scientist at the Institute for Work and Health, where he's been a researcher since 1997. He focuses primarily on the prevention of musculoskeletal disorders, as well as on the implementation of programs and practices to prevent work injury and disability related to physical and mental health. His research projects include evaluations of participatory ergonomics interventions, evaluations of workplace MSD and mental health practices and programs and their implementation, and systematic reviews of the prevention literature. Dwayne also practices and researches integrated knowledge transfer and exchange. And so today he's going to be talking about understanding PTSI program implementation processes in Alberta first responder organizations. Over to you, Dwayne. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monique. And thank you all for joining me in this presentation about PTSI program implementation in Alberta first responder organizations. I'd like to mention that this project was funded by the Alberta Supporting Psychological Health in First Responders grant. So I'll start off by thanking the research team from IWH, the University of Alberta, and from Wayfound, as well as a big thank you to the Stakeholder Advisory Committee. Many first responder organizations from Alberta and a couple from outside of Alberta joined us. This group of people was very engaged and very helpful throughout the project. So in case you can't stay till the end, I'll say my key messages now. We found 6 themes that were related to implementation experiences: getting buy-in first, collaborating and champions, ongoing awareness building, ensuring adequate resources, importance of planning, and one size does not fit all. We also have created a summary of implementation processes, if you will, and found that in the planning phase, there were small teams involved, mostly including program champions that conducted informal assessments. In the implementation or delivery phase, we heard that people were rushing to deliver the programs and then often needed to revisit some of the planning steps along the way. And that there were staffing and training challenges. In the maintenance phase, or the sustaining a program phase, there were evaluation challenges that we heard about and a clear need for program flexibility to meet the various and changing needs of the members. Some of this will make a little bit more sense as I go through the rest of the presentation. I'll start by giving a bit of background or why we did the study, a couple of slides about methods, and then really launch into the results. So PTSI, or post-traumatic stress injury, is a considerable burden for first responders, but also for their families, their workplaces, and society at large. The scientific evidence about the effectiveness of PTSI interventions mostly comes from the clinical literature and is modest at best. But regardless of the state of the scientific evidence, first responder organizations or workplaces must develop ways to protect their workers and protect them from work disability as well as injury. So a previous research project suggested that the implementation of PTSI programs in workplaces was a challenge for first responder organizations. And that paper is now available. The current project paper is currently under peer review. So hopefully we'll be out soon. So our project objectives and some of the methods. So there was two objectives in this project, but I'm only going to speak to the first objective in this presentation, mostly for time reasons. So the first objective was to examine current implementation approaches as well as key facilitators and challenges in Alberta first responder organizations. And to do that, we conducted semi-structured interviews with key informants involved in program implementation from those Alberta first responder organizations. We were looking to determine the current processes as well as the challenges in that. Our analysis was a thematic analysis as well as a description of the implementation processes. I'll mention a little bit about objective 2 at the very end of the presentation. We were guided by two implementation science frameworks in this project, the Practical Implementation Sustainability Model, or PRISM, and the Quality Implementation Framework, or the QIF. And just briefly, what I'll say is that we were guided by the overarching phases in the PRISM model. So there were 3 phases. And while there was a lot of overlap, we chose to use the Quality Implementation Framework steps or processes within each phase. It made for a bit of a simpler model to follow and to explain. So that's what we started with. Our results then. So we interviewed 20 key informants from fire, police, and paramedic organizations in Alberta. Those that had a role in program delivery, which is basically the implementation phase, I guess. The characteristics of our participants are in this table. The key point I want to raise is that we purposely wanted to get representation from fire, paramedic, and police, which we were successful in. So these were the programs that we heard were being implemented. This is a list. I won't go through the list. I just want to say that we found programs that were quite specific to PTSI, and some that were a bit broader, mental health, and even broader in the health and wellness kind of programs. So these were the programs that we heard about in the processes of implementation in this project. Now I'm going to talk about the overarching themes and give some of the representative quotes for each of them. So, getting buy-in first. So I'll read the quote. Having the buy-in from the leadership, I would say to get that before you start planning, because without the approval, you won't get anywhere, right? So buy-in from the top and then having the right people in charge of this. This person was describing the steps kind of implementation after the program was developed, basically. And while this quote focuses on leadership, we heard consistently across the participants that in fact that members from all levels of the organization need to buy in. And that includes those who have a mental health issue or a PTSI. One of the second steps, I think, along the path of implementation was described as collaborating and champions. All of our champions are talking to their peers. We don't need a marketing strategy because we have this army of champions out there that see the benefit of what they're doing and are supportive. So this quote ties together a lot of the elements, but the theme was about the need to work together to address PTSI. Good levels of communication and trust were paramount, and most of the people involved were considered program champions. These were often people with lived experience. The next theme, and these themes are interrelated. So as you'll see, I'll try to connect a couple of these as I move forward. Ongoing awareness building. So another barrier we continue to struggle with is because we're under the umbrella of a large municipality that wants us to have the same as everybody else. And that lack of understanding of the work and the constant trauma that first responders are exposed to is very evident. So we heard that people or talked about their organizations being more aware of mental health than in the past. And that seemed to be the reason why some of these programs were being developed and implemented. But there was a consistent message that they still needed to build awareness or continue to build awareness in their organizations, but also beyond their organizations in the municipality and province. And that is tied to those that have the purse strings. So it's very connected to this next theme, which is ensuring adequate resources. I need more facilitators because right now we only have 3 members that are fully trained, and including our casual staff, we have many workers. So that's the biggest challenge right now. So we heard that in the process of implementation or delivering programs, there was a clear need to have ongoing resources from the starting point to develop, but also implement and maintain these programs. There were challenges in how to ensure adequate resources as well. And some of that was related to the importance of planning. So the more planning we do and reviewing of material, the better of a product we put out. I think many of us are trying to meet the demand so quick that we aren't thinking it through fully. So we heard people explain that it takes time to get it right, both from a program development point of view and from a delivery point of view. But many people talk to us about, well, that goes against our first responder mode to rush in to fix the problem. So when issues around funding or staffing emerge, there's this idea of going back to planning and figuring out, okay, we should have thought about this first. But many somewhat jokingly said, but that's not what first responders do. We go right to the problem and try to fix it. And the last theme was one size does not fit all. One of the things I'm learning is there's a lot more challenges than you think there are going to be, especially because everybody has such unique needs and it's such a sensitive issue that has to be dealt with. It's hard to be writing the perfect flow process. So we heard in light of, in fact, some of the planning challenges, that there was a need for flexibility in the program content. And sometimes that appeared as the program was being delivered. So the program content, but as well as how the program is being implemented, there was a need for flexibility. And this quote captured it, I thought, nicely with the writing the perfect flow process. So there were the main 6 themes of this study. Now I'm going to go on to talk a little bit about a description of the implementation process as we heard it. So there was some variation, but there were more commonalities about the implementation processes across fire, paramedic, and police. It was consistently noted that there were challenges with finding information or learning about program implementation to guide the teams involved. And this kind of goes back to the rushing in. Many people were diving in and then realized, we could have maybe looked for some guidance on implementation. But we were constantly reminded as we were doing the interview process that PTSI programs were urgently needed in these organizations. So as an overview, we're looking now at the planning phase. Many of the people we spoke to in the interviews were in this phase or had returned to it. And we heard that the first step is getting buy-in. Um, the second step is usually to start with small teams of the right people, those that are credible. Those are the people with lived experience, obviously. And those were often identified as program champions. But there were challenges. So many of the people that started either developing or delivering the programs, this was off the side of their desk. So this was in addition to their regular duties or tasks. We heard that participants rarely conduct formal assessment of the needs, fit, or capacity of the organization. Therefore, organizational capacity was not always there. And there was discovery processes during the implementation phases as to when things were needed. Approval processes for space and staff seemed to be considered the most challenging in the planning phase. Partly because they didn't know how popular the program was going to be, I think, because the next phase gives some indication of that. Some of our participants were in this phase, the implementation or delivery phase, and they were delivering the program to members. Often we heard that they were returning to planning activities as the program delivery was underway, trying to figure out, okay, what is actually needed? What do we have in place? Formal implementation plans outlining the implementation tasks and timelines were often not developed. And again, this was attributed to this idea of rushing to deliver. Very little mention of formal evaluation, but there was a demand for evaluation. It was required to get the approvals and the funds to maintain or to continue to deliver the program. Additional staffing and training needs were often noted, especially when the demand for the programs increased. So the communication was good. They have the program champions. These were trustworthy individuals who were communicating, which meant that people were taking advantage of the available programs. But then we need to increase the staffing. We need to train those staff to make sure that we can address the needs of the members of the organization. And lastly, the maintenance, or sometimes it's called the sustainment phase. So this is the idea of maintaining that program, sometimes requiring some adaptations. While there were few that were in this phase or felt that they were in this phase, many were able to reflect on their lessons learned and look forward to how they might, what their concerns were about maintaining the programs. One of the key things that we heard was they noted that the programs, as well as their delivery, needed to be flexible to meet the various member needs related to PTSI or mental health. And these changing needs or unexpected needs were a key part of this. A key challenge was the demand to provide proof that the program was actually being used and was effective. Many people talked about this as a continual challenge. Every time they turned around, they needed some proof to maintain the funding or the space that they were using. However, many felt unequipped to conduct the formal evaluations. And they, they, they many often focused on the challenges to maintain the confidentiality of program users with the informal program evaluations that they were being asked to do. They kept being asked to provide proof that this was being used, sometimes being asked for the names of those that are users. So we heard this challenge about confidentiality, and particularly when you're talking about mental health, many of our participants talked about that as a big challenge. So I talked about evaluations, but actually few mentioned the evaluation of the implementation. Most of the evaluation discussion or comments back to us were about program evaluation. So this was back to the development stages, if you will. So that covers a bit quickly, I think, some of the main pieces of this research. It is a bit of a good news story, but so we have some strengths and limitations of our study. So the strengths are that we based our findings on the experiences of a range of fire, paramedic, and police organizations, as well as some service providers which worked in all of those. The interview data provided rich information, and our integrated knowledge transfer and exchange approach included the advisory committee, who helped us greatly throughout the project, starting with recruitment, but also helped us interpret some of the findings that we had. One of the other strengths was the KT workshops that we held, which was more related to Objective 2, but it was able to provide us with some immediate feedback, and then allowed us to move forward with the development of implementation strategies that were meaningful and relevant for the organizations. There are, however, some limitations. While we gathered information from different first responder organizations, we are missing information from corrections, border services, and public safety communications. The focus in this project was on Alberta, so we do need to consider how things are in other Canadian provinces and territories. And it turned out that our emphasis really was on the earlier stages of program implementation, because that's where many people were. And our focus was on the current processes. So that's why we have that. And lastly, but importantly, we may not have captured views that oppose the need for workplace PTSI programs, because it's very unlikely that individuals who have that view would participate or volunteer to be part of the study. So I will go back to, oh no, I'll go to a discussion and then wrap up with the final messages, key messages. So the good news, many Alberta first responder organizations were developing and implementing PTSI programs in their workplaces. Many of them talked about an improved organizational culture, which was key to allowing that development and implementation. So in this project, we were very interested in understanding the current processes so that we can, I think, do more research to better understand how implementation can impact on the effectiveness of the programs that are being implemented. We know from other research literature that even the most effective program can suffer when it's not implemented well. If people aren't using it or able to access it, the program is not going to have the desired effect. So there were some key challenges noted: the lack of formal implementation plans, and perhaps the time taken to create those plans, lack of formal evaluation, and of course, resources. I have yet to conduct a study where time and money were not barriers to the success of program implementation. So briefly, our next steps, I want to mention that we're working on Objective 2 and plan to share the co-created implementation strategies soon. So I can only say at this moment, please stay tuned. And we have a new project that is examining the implementation of a comprehensive return to work program in a police service. That project will give us a little bit more detail as we're following the process and not just asking people to reflect on what they have been doing. So what I talked about was these key messages, or these are the key messages that I talked about in this presentation. So we had 6 themes: getting buy-in first, collaborating in champions, ongoing awareness building, ensuring adequate resources, importance of planning, and one size does not fit all. I tried to indicate that there's some definite interrelationship between those, and you can see in the implementation processes that there's some similarities in terms of what we heard, obviously. So the overview of implementation processes, we have this planning phase, typically starting with small teams and program champions, those that are often with lived experience. And they were conducting informal assessments, usually off the side of their desk. I'll add that one in. In the implementation or delivery phase, we heard there was a rush to deliver. There was a need to get these programs to individuals, which resulted sometimes in a need to revisit the planning stages to figuring things out. Staffing and training challenges are what we heard most often in this delivery phase. The maintenance phase, people were able to project about that. Evaluation challenges was the main challenge. as well as understanding the need for program flexibility to meet various and changing needs of the members. Okay, so I should acknowledge once again, the funding was from the Alberta Supporting Psychological Health and First Responders Grant. The Institute for Work and Health operates with the support of Ontario, and the views expressed in this presentation are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of, let's say, either province at this point. So I hope that I've left a fair bit of time for questions and comments. I look forward to them. If we don't get to them all, please send me an email. I'm happy to engage with you directly. And if you want to learn more about IWH evidence-based practices, please check out these various platforms. I
Okay.
will go back to my email so that if you want to ask me, please send me an email.
Okay, thank you very much, Dwayne, for a really interesting presentation. Thank you to all of you who are attending. If you have a question or a comment, please type it in the Q&A box. We do have a few already. So let me start us off, Dwayne, with some of those questions. You mentioned the desire to rush in and fix and do something. And so how did any of your participants talk about how they balanced the need to do something now because it is a problem with the kind of need to maybe think through things and move a bit more slowly? Did they talk about how they were dealing with that, or were they just kind of what was going on?
Yeah, we heard a fair bit about that sort of, I guess it was um, it was an enforced balance. So many times there was this desire, therefore development steps ended up happening pretty quickly. Um, they focused really on the development of the program, but just didn't think about what the steps for implementing or delivering that program were going to take. So what we heard was they got they did some planning. They did talk about the needs of the organization, but usually in an informal way. But they didn't often do the evaluation of fit. How does this fit with our organization and what is our capacity? So that's where they rushed in, starting with a program that they've developed, and then oftentimes had to sort of circle back and go, okay, we need to find out a little bit more about how this might fit with our organization, but what are our resources and how can we deliver this program in a consistent way? So it was an after the fact consideration about planning. So many talked about how important it was, having been sort of ignoring it and then realizing, oops, we need to figure this out a little bit.
Right. Um, just to follow up a little bit on that, you mentioned that when people had thought of evaluation, and often they hadn't, it was more about the program evaluation and not the implementation evaluation. What would be examples of the difference in what would you look for if you want to see if you're implementing it well as opposed to the program itself is working?
Right. So if you're looking at program evaluation, you're looking at the effectiveness. So then you would be looking at whether or not people are uh, getting benefit and reducing their work disability as a result of entering or being participating in the program. The implementation evaluation would be how it's being delivered. And so early stages would be those assessments of fit, capacity, and then how it's being delivered. Are people being reached? Do they know about the program? If they do know about that, can they access the program? Do we have space for people? Is there a way to protect their confidentiality? So these are the sort of process steps and these are the important steps about delivery. So that's the main difference. And then of course the evaluation of that often refers to the adoption and communication of the program. So people need to be aware and being able to access it. Those are the early stages. Uh, Further evaluation would then, talk about what was the actual process and was it effective. So there's a little bit of an element of effectiveness in that as well.
Okay. All right. We have a number of questions coming in. Thank you. You had mentioned that you didn't have any corrections people in your study. And we have someone who is asking whether or not you can tell us why or why not prisons were not included.
It was entirely a feasibility issue. We needed to focus on a few places so that we could better understand this process. And it grew out of a project that we started in with police. So there was no other reason other than feasibility. Um, we've learned since in communicating with some corrections people that there are some similarities, and I'm sure we may have been able to include it, but it really came down to a feasibility issue.
Okay. Someone is asking whether or not in any of the programs, I know you didn't do a deep dive into all the specifics of the programs, but did it appear that families were included in any of the development of the programs that you were learning about?
Family was often mentioned as an important component, and there were, in fact, some of the programs that were focused on. There was one program that was actually focused on, I think it was called rebuilding families. So mentioned often. Certainly, spouses were mentioned as a key part of the recovery process, and understanding the needs process. Um, so in the more general programs, we heard more about it. In some of the more specific mental health or PTSI programs, mentioned, but not as focused.
Okay, thank you. Someone is asking about the specificity of the programs for first responders and whether or not they might be generable to other groups of workers. Did you have people talk about that? You mentioned at the beginning about sort of the one size fits all perception sometimes municipalities seem to have. But did anyone bring this up, issues of specificity and generalizability?
Uh, yes and no. I think where the specificity really came up was some of the organizations that we spoke with had tried programs or developed programs and then abandoned them or moved on and either developed their own or decided to go with another, let's call it an off-the-shelf program. And it tended to be that that was the reason fit, right? So it didn't quite fit with our organization. Um, but what I can't answer is whether that was because it was first responder or not. They did talk about we tried this, it didn't seem to work or wasn't being used, and then we moved on to this, and suddenly we are getting something out of it. So yeah, there's my yes and no response.
Okay, thank you. Couple of, I think, probably fairly quick questions. Someone asks, what does IKTE mean? Can you
Oh,
explain
sorry.
that?
Integrated knowledge transfer and exchange. Um, that's just too many words to put in a table. It was mentioned earlier in the presentation, so I just dove in. I apologize for that.
No worries. Now we know. Can you also give an example of a PTSI program, intervention program in the workplace? Just sort of what some of these looked like, or were they quite variable?
Well, there were quite a few different programs that were being implemented for the sake of. I'm going to have to slide up to that slide, so please bear with me as I move back up to the list. The CSID, CSIM were often, sorry, critical incident stress management, peer-to-peer support, even though reintegration is a kind of a general term, that there were Certainly, some of the programs that were called reintegration that were very focused on mental health and PTSI. Before operational stress seemed to be a very popular program, and seemed to be something that many of the organizations were using, sometimes in combination with others. So I didn't dive into that description with our participants, and can only kind of reflect at that level um, on whether they're specific. Some were developed by the organizations. Many of these exist, and many of the programs were used. So there is a rebuilding family. I even got that right, and a family counseling program. I should mention that. But there were different approaches, and sometimes it was because one program perhaps wasn't specific enough, and then the organization moved on. Sometimes there was a discussion about, well, that program just wasn't liked, that people did not want to use it, and so then they moved on to find something else.
So
I hope
it
that
actually
answers.
ties in with another question about
Okay.
to the extent that programs tended to be built in-house for their specific
Right.
needs versus adopting something wholeheartedly or adapting something. To what extent did you hear about that?
I think most of the programs that we heard about that were being implemented were known by more than one organization. So they weren't completely developed from the ground up. It's the amount of adaptation or modification that differed across the different organizations. So um, many of the programs were modified, and that was done usually to meet the what was considered the unique needs of the different organizations. So it really was, I wouldn't call them off the shelf. We see, employee assistance programs. Those are designed and are not adaptable, whereas the others tended to be adapted. There was an interesting conversation that we had about should programs be adapted, because how can we do a good evaluation of them then? But it has to meet the needs of the organization. So I do think it's a valid thing to modify or adapt the program.
Okay, thank you. I've got more questions, but someone is asking if you could put up your resources slide again. So I'm not, I don't know if they mean,
This one,
I'm not sure.
adequate resources.
I think,
Let's,
did you, maybe it was the list of programs because you
okay.
didn't have a list of resources of where to go next and things like that, I'm
Oh, it
assuming.
might be this.
I'm not sure.
All right. Well, fire away and I'll
If
see
it's
if I
not
can.
the right slide, let me know.
Okay.
And I will try to get that up for you.
I'll go
And
here.
again, the slides will all be available very shortly, so you can have all of them. Let me, though, ask some other questions. We do have quite a few questions that are coming in.
Okay.
Did you deal with any specific, or did it come up any specific health risks during the study beyond PTSI? So was were there any specific health risks that were coming up that people were dealing with as part of these programs?
Yeah. So since our focus was on implementation, we did not ask the kinds of questions that would go deep into that. I can say that there was often a discussion more broadly about mental health. But beyond that, I can't say we did not ask or look for information about any of the specific injuries. We did not ask about diagnoses. We were so focused on the implementation side of things that that was not the line of questioning.
Okay. Um, in looking at these programs, these PTSI programs,
Mhm.
there can be organizational factors, operational issues, and the program itself that are all coming into play in supporting or not supporting the outcomes for workers. Was there recognition of other factors that need, and were they being addressed in PTSI programs like organizational issues and operational issues?
Yes, definitely. Our participants talked about. So I think it even started from the increased awareness. So we did not ask explicitly about the awareness of mental health issues in workplaces, but it was one of the first things that people wanted to say. The reason we're developing this program is that that we have this better awareness and the need to address it. Um, so I think what we learned is that as the programs were being developed, they were running up against some of the operational issues, um, um, and they were part of the discussion. So we could even go so far. This I'm a little bit on the edge here, but we could go so far as to say some of the adaptations of these programs were to address some of that operational occupational stress that was happening. So that was part of the modifications, and it was this understanding that first responders will experience trauma over time and how to best address what happens when they experience the trauma, right? So we know that you can't avoid the trauma. That does not happen in first responder workplaces. So yes, it was part of the conversation. It was not something that we dove into in much more depth than that.
Okay, I'm going to switch my order because you mentioned something that relates to a question that I have from someone who is curious about whether or not these programs could be used and delivered almost as a prevention.
Mm.
So you said it's, this is part of the life often of these workers, the exposure to trauma. Was there any discussion of using some of the PTSI programs in a more preventive way as opposed to the reactive after the fact way?
So while we didn't ask that way, I think there was some of that. But I think it's very slippery slope to go down that path. So from a researcher perspective. So what I would say is that one of the key things that I think we heard or put it together is that knowing that these programs are in place and exist is something that's very important, and can help prevent. So that means that people know they're available and can turn to them early enough. That seemed to be the key part. And then let me tie it back also to one of the themes, getting the buy-in. So what we heard about member buy-in is that there has to be a realization that you do need the program. And so that's the piece that we might say is somewhat preventive, but it's really preventing the more serious work disability that was what we engaged in. Um, Preventing PTSI is not something that we looked for, and from my understanding in literature, is not something that is a good idea to go for.
Okay. Someone is asking that you mentioned evaluation challenges were faced. Why? What were the challenges? Was this on the logistics side, or was this capacity or not knowing how to evaluate? And so that's the first part. And then another question of when there had been some evaluation, what was it? Were the programs working? But let's first of all talk about why weren't there more evaluations done?
Yeah, this was mostly around this bullet point. Many felt unequipped to conduct formal evaluation. So, and it stems back to an earlier point I made about the desire for more information about implementation processes. Many of the individuals we talked to said, "I wish we'd known a little bit more about implementation. I wish we could find information about implementation." So, I think that and the planning, right? So the rushing in to deliver meant that they didn't plan on evaluating, but then they were asked to evaluate. And so what ended up happening most often, at least in early stages, was they were using some informal way, informal evaluation. Yeah, we have lots of people using the program and they are happy with it. And that is the level that mostly we heard. So it is that yeah, the ability to conduct, the understanding of the need of it, it just wasn't there. It was certainly it got there, and they realized why that was important, but they were already delivering, and so it hadn't caught up yet.
So mostly satisfaction. What was anyone talking about? We've looked at, returning to work. We've looked at sustaining work, and the program seems to be helping. Was any of that going on at this point? It may be early for some of the programs.
It was a bit early. There were people who said that they had had success with their programs, but we did not dig that deep into that element. And usually, if they said that, we asked, was that related to the implementation, or how did you feel about the success of the implementation, which um, didn't get the same response.
Okay. And thank you everyone for your questions. We'll keep going. Um, You mentioned at the outset of the presentation, Dwayne, that there seemed to be improved organizational culture
Mhm.
that was enabling a number of these programs to be created and exist. Do you know what the changes are? Did people give examples of what had changed that was an improvement?
Yeah, and this comes a little bit from the previous study as well. So I'm going to combine a little bit there because the people our participants in this study kind of reiterated. There were two important elements. I think there was more awareness in the members in general. There was more of a willingness to talk about it. That was often ascribed to the younger members, the newer members coming in. And there was a change in the old guard. So leadership was considered resistant in the past, and many people reported that leaders were more open to having these discussions, um, not saying buck up and get on with it, but let's see how we should deal with this exposure to stress. Some of that really was reflected in lived experience where leadership was then more credible and trusted about mental health as well. So those were I think, the key driving forces that we heard about.
Okay, thank you. In terms of all of the types of programs, and I know they were quite diverse,
Mhm.
did any stand out as more effective than others, either in their scope or the challenges that they were facing or were able to overcome in terms of implementing them? So did, using resources efficiently, strong uptake? Were there some things that people were saying this is making it successful or it's more of a problematic implementation?
Yeah, we didn't go down that path of inquiry, so I can't really talk about the individual programs. Um, I would say that there were some that were more easily implemented, or that was the sense that we had. Maybe most often because they were less resource demanding, or already existing and then adapted. But other than that, we did not talk about the effectiveness. This was a focus really was on implementation, um, because that seemed to be the big barrier from the previous study.
Okay. About flexibility now in programs.
Mhm.
That flexibility in implementation would likely be essential to helping with the success and with full implementation. Do you have any nuggets to share on how to be a success in implementing the program while at the same time being flexible to changes and needs?
Right, yeah. I think in much of my research with workplaces, flexibility is one of the more challenging things in general. In terms of the program flexibility, what people talked about there was the sort of those people who were delivering. So this is like the one-on-one flexibility to recognize when the needs of the member have changed, or that it was a bit broader need than what might have presented early on. So there was a lot of or some discussion about that one-on-one flexibility to move forward, but not go too fast with any individual based on their needs and the fact that their needs may change over time. The 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 process flexibility then I think was linked to that in the sense that okay, this means we don't move to the next step as fast as we thought we were going to. This may not involve the next program deliverer. So it's linked, but there was little talk about that process. It was mostly about what was happening at the individual program level and the needs to be flexible to an individual's needs.
In terms of the evaluation, someone comments that they've had difficulty with this aspect of programs, and there's not a lot of data out there to guide people. Is this a common struggle? Are people alone? Is there any place they can go to kind
Mm.
of learn more?
From our experience with this study and the previous one, it does seem to be a common struggle. I can only talk to the research at this level. Um, I suspect that there might be some clinical literature that might address this, but how applicable it is within a workplace setting, um, with or without trained therapists is a question that I just can't answer. My experience over time in looking at work disability, and prevention programs is that workplaces struggle with flexibility, and so that is a common a barrier or challenge.
Okay. Do you have a sense, Dwayne, about how many programs are currently available in Alberta? Are people doing everything all over the place? Are there a lot of programs, or is this still something that's new and emerging?
When we conducted the study, I would say it was newer and emerging. There there was awareness in the group that we spoke with, and the broader group when we did our workshops, of a variety of programs. Um, but again, there was this element of evidence-based. So people did talk about we want the best programs, the most effective programs, but there's not much in the scientific literature, especially at the workplace or organization level, that can guide that. So there was a sense that people were on their own, having to pick and choose and adapt accordingly. We heard about that a lot. But that is actually an important part of evidence-based medicine. Or evidence-based practice, that is, you use the best available evidence. So if that means that you heard from other organizations this program was helpful, then that's one of the ways to go ahead and try it. And I think that is another thing that I should repeat. This was a good news study. We learned about some of the challenges of implementation, but it was very clear that many organizations in the province were developing and implementing programs to reduce the work disability. So, um,
Excellent. Yes. We'll try and maybe get two more questions in, and I'm sorry if they're not the questions that you asked. Please do feel free to send Dwayne an email. So, Dwayne, did some organizations have a dedicated role, someone to monitor the program planning implementation? And do you think that doing something like that would help with the future maintenance of a program, potentially having someone, this is your part of your job, not off the side of your desk?
yeah, there were some that had. So I think we can't avoid mentioning then organization size. So larger organizations, or those that are larger, tended to have a little bit more available staff to dedicate more time to. But as soon as we got away from larger organizations, the challenge was consistent. So medium, there may be some element of rural as well there because there's a confounder between large and rural. So we didn't detect that, but we're also not looking necessarily to test against the different organizations. We needed to start by looking at what does this implementation process look like out there so that we can do some further research and maybe help to guide that in a as we learn more about it. So there's a wishy-washy answer.
Okay. And unfortunately, our last question, because we just are running out of time. Before you can kind of go about implementing a program, you need to know what it is that is the problem, what the needs are. Did anyone talk about how that early phase of, sort of, I guess, developing and implementing the types of data they might have collected on needs assessments? Did they give people mental health surveys, like the
Mm.
Guarding Minds at Work? Do you know how they determined what the problems and the needs were?
Yeah, I can't say exactly. I think the key thing that we heard was that there were not many formal assessments. Um, but people did talk about knowing that their organization needed a program, and therefore there was a sense of the need. But depending at the level, so the lack of formal evaluation is what really came out there. But that's not to say that that didn't go on. It's just that we didn't hear about it, and that may have been our focus on just finding out, did you do that? We didn't ask what. And so I can't say exactly. We did hear that some seemed to have a better sense. There were some that had done more informal assessments than others, but it did tend to be informal as opposed to formal. Again, that's what we heard, and we didn't dive in as deeply in that particular element. Um,
Okay. Okay, well, I'm sorry that this is all the time we have. Thank you. There are lots of comments, Dwayne, thanking you for a great presentation and appreciating that there's more of a realization that the planning and implementation process is so important. I want to thank everybody for attending and for the terrific questions that all of you asked. And Dwayne will get a copy of all the questions and you can reach out to him as well. I hope that you will be able to join us again back in our next presentation will be in February, on February 24th. Dr. Nancy Carnide will be presenting, and she'll be talking about using cannabis to manage symptoms of work-related injuries, experiences of injured workers in Ontario. So thank you again, Dwayne, for your presentation today, and thank you everyone for attending.